Oh my god. Hello, this is Chiak. I'm adjusting everything here. Okay. So, this is part 2 of the Dead Space Catalyst book. When I say part 2, despite being composed of 3 chapters, it really is. It's, I think, about 11 pages. And this particular reading section is going to be very short, I imagine. Well, let's see how 11 minutes go. Mind you, I think some of it's a bit prose heavy. Either way, Dead Space Catalyst, Part 2, Chapter 9. When he pulled the trigger, the gun did not do what he had been told it would do. Did not make a funny joke. Instead, it killed the man Fisher. Who had told him? He couldn't remember now. Not for certain. Not after all he'd been through. And he wasn't entirely sure that it had been someone outside of him. There were voices inside of him as well. And these were the voices that, at times, he could not help but listen to. But no. This had been, he was sure, an outside voice. Or not sure exactly, but almost sure. Nearly sure. Jency was an outside voice. So was his mother. But his mother, now that she was gone, had become an inside voice too. And Jency, when he was away from him, could become an inside voice as well. How was he to keep it all straight? But still, Istvan was pretty sure that the voice that had given him the gun had been an outside voice. Not an inside voice. Not an inside one. He had been more than pretty sure on off, and instead of spraying red dye like it was supposed to, had blown apart the man Fisher's head. Who was the man Fisher? He didn't even really know. Just a man that someone inside of him or outside of him wanted sprayed with red dye to humiliate him. A kind of joke, the voice had explained to him. No, it must have been an outside voice. He remembered seeing a body alongside with it. There had been a man with a pale face, missing most of his hair. He had spoken with him for a while, and Istvan had been fed by him. And it had gone on for days, perhaps, or longer than that. The voice attached to the man asking questions, little needles sticking into his skin, and then the man nodding when Istvan answered them in the way he liked, and gently or roughly teaching him other answers when Istvan answered in a way that he did not like. And it had been through their conversation, that his purpose had developed. It wasn't like the voice was exactly telling him what his purpose was. More like he was coming to it on his own. But he had to admit now that he had time to think, that the voice had been like a funnel, directing him, guiding him in, slowly narrowing out all other possibilities. Like those chutes in the vids you drive cattle down just before you shoot them in the head with a bolt gun, or pigs. Was the voice outside or inside? That was the question now. If it was inside, it would come back and he would talk to it, try to understand what had gone wrong, what he had done wrong, why he had managed to kill the man Fisher instead of fulfilling his purpose. If the voice was outside, then it was a trickier question. It might come back, or it might not. There was no way of saying. And outside voices, he knew from experiences were not always direct, not always honest. They would say things they didn't mean. Voices inside weren't like that. Not usually, anyway. Where was he now? For a while, he had been in a sack, or his head had been in a sack anyway. His arms and legs had been tied and were slowly going numb, and then a bunch of men wearing uniforms had appeared and put his head in a sack. It reminded him of what they used to do with horses. He had read about it as a way to calm them when they had to go past something difficult or impossible, like a fire. They put their heads in the bag. They put their heads in bags, and then they couldn't see enough to get frightened. Did they think he was frightened? Of what? Horses also would eat food out of a bag hanging from their faces, but that wasn't exactly the same thing since the whole head wasn't in a sack. I'm like a horse, he had thought, though it was hard to think that with his arms and legs tied behind his back. You couldn't do that with a horse, he thought, unless you broke their limbs and folded them back the wrong way. That probably, at the very least, cripple it. And that made him feel like maybe they had done that to him, had broken his legs and limbs. And so he began to struggle. The inside of the bag smelled like sweat. And then suddenly there were hands on him, hands all over him, and they were lifting him up and carrying him away. He was in a vehicle. He could tell by the way the floor he was lying on was rumbling, and by the hum of the electric motor. Then someone sat him up and leaned him back against something and cut the straps holding his wrists together, and he began to chafe his hands to bring the feeling back. Someone, too, maybe the same someone, cut the straps on his legs, and feeling also began to come back there. He started to reach up to remove the sack that was over his head, but someone grabbed his hands and pushed them down. No, a voice said. Don't touch it. Leave it on. He was pretty sure it was an outside voice, but since all he could see was the inside of the sack, how could he be absolutely sure? He decided in any case to listen to it, to do what it said. They were in the vehicle for what felt like a long time. Maybe not all that long, a voice inside his head suggested, but no, he had to disagree. It was a long time. Then the vehicle stopped. For a while, he just sat there, listening to muttering voices around him and inside of him. And then there was the sound of metal scraping. Hands had grabbed him and were helping him to his feet and then pushing him out. He almost fell while leaving the vehicle, but they were there to catch him. For a moment, he could hear the sounds of the dome, and he could see the light, a hint of it, through the weave of his sack. But quickly they were in another space where it was quieter, enclosed. Where are we? He asked. But maybe his voice was muffled by the sack because they didn't answer. Nobody answered him. Though whoever was holding his right arm did, at least, tighten their grip. A clattering sound as he was propelled forward, his shoes now on a different sort of flooring, something slick and hard, and then was abruptly jerked to the right. He knocked against something that must have been the side of a doorway, and then hands were pushing on the tops of his shoulders, and it took him a moment to realize that they were trying to get him to sit. Why don't they just say sit? He wondered. Like they would a dog. Like they would to a dog. Why aren't they talking? Slowly he lowered himself down until he found something solid beneath him, and then relaxed into it. For a few minutes, there was the noise of bodies moving, tramping back and forth in the rough of boots against floors, all of it slightly dampened by the fabric surrounding his head. Then, Slowly it faded. Distance. A door slowly closed, and noise became silence, apart from the sound of his breathing within the sack. He sat there, waiting. Was he alone? He didn't know, but suspected so. For a moment he held his breath and listened, but still heard nothing. What, he wondered, should he do? Carefully he lifted one hand to the sack, felt his face through it, waiting for a hand to come and push his hand down and away. When it did not, he slowly pulled the sack off his head. He was facing into a corner, not more than a foot or so away from each wall, like a schoolboy being punished. First horse, then dog, then schoolboy, he thought. I'm evolving. He rubbed his face, then slowly turned. Behind him was a stretch of open floor, then a large table on the other side of which sat a small gray man. The man was motionless, just watching him. When he saw that Istvin had noticed him, he smiled. Come, pull your chair closer, he said, and patted the table. Why should I? Asked Istvin. Why shouldn't you? The man responded, and Istvin, having no ready response to this, considered for a moment and then pulled his chair to the table. Do you know what you've done? Asked the small gray man. Why are you gray? Asked Istvin. Excuse me? Well, why are you gray? That's not a normal color. Are you real? Are you the shadow man? Do I look gray to you? Istvin nodded. Interesting, said the man. I don't know if it's a normal color or not. I don't know how you typically see things. I've always thought of myself as having a normal color. And yes, I am real. Istvin nodded again, then stared at the table. What about you? Asked the gray man. Do you think of yourself as real? Me? Said Istvin, surprised. Of course I'm real. Why wouldn't I be? That's good, said the man and smiled. Then, both of you speak seriously. About what? About what you did. Istvin folded his arms. I don't think it went right, he said. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. No. How was it supposed to happen? He wasn't supposed to get hurt. Are you sure? No, Istvin realized. He wasn't sure. That was what what was troubling him. Maybe the man Fisher was supposed to get hurt. Maybe he had been tricked. Or maybe he had simply misunderstood. Not knowing what to answer, he simply didn't answer. He looked up, and the gray man was still there, across the table, watching him with unblinking eyes. You'll be with us for a long time, said the gray man. Why? Asked Istvin. Because of what you did, said the gray man. You killed someone. Not only that, you ended up killing someone political. You assassinated him. He was only a councilman, but he was important in other ways. Important to us. That means you belong to us now. To me. Istvin felt anger rising in him. I don't belong to anybody, he said. It's just a figure of speech, said the gray man affably. What I mean is that you are now an enemy of the state. We have to understand what you did and who convinced you to do it. We know you didn't plan this yourself. We're eager enough to understand that we'll use any means necessary to have our answers. I won't tell you anything, said Istvin. Why should I? The gray man smiled. We're patient, he said. We don't need the answers right away, but eventually you will tell us everything we want to know. Istvin shook his head and waited for the gray man to disappear. But he didn't disappear. You're not real, Istvin claimed. We already agreed I was real, said the man. Did we? Asked Istvin. Was that someone else? The gray man smiled. I like you, Istvin, he said. And then a moment later, everything around Istvin started to go strange, the light changing, going bloody. The gray man started to fold himself up. First, he folded one arm up, and then the other arm, and then he bent in the middle of the back and folded backward. When he was done, he was nothing but a strange gray square lying flat in the chair. Istvin reached across the table and picked it up. Open it. Open it, a voice inside him was saying, and so he did, slowly unfolding it until he had become a man again. He set it up in the chair and then took a step back to look at it. When he did, the light went back to normal. It was a man, all right. Only it wasn't the gray man. It was a man in a uniform with a red face, and from the face was coming a voice that was yelling. When it stopped for a moment so that the man could draw his breath, Istvin stuck his hand out. I'm Istvin, he said. Put it there. He closed his hand around the man's hand and shook it, only it wasn't a hand at all, but a neck. As it turned out, the man's neck. Abruptly, he was lying on the ground with other people's hands on him, holding him down. What have I done? He wondered. What's wrong with me? He was like that for a while, and then they hauled him up and set him in the chair again. This time they tied his hands to the arms of the chair. There were more men in the room, one to either side of him, in fact. The red-faced man was still there, sitting on the other side of the table now and rubbing his neck, looking a little frightened. What about you? Asked Istvin. Are you real? What's wrong with you? The red-faced man said, which was enough to make Istvin think that yes, this man was real, since he had heard that very question posed to him so many times before by people who actually were real. He and the red-faced man talked for a long time. The red-faced man had a lot of interest in the politician and what had happened to him, and why Istvin had shot him. He seemed to want to ask the same questions again and again in slightly different ways. Each time a question was asked, Istvin did his best to answer, but the man never seemed satisfied. Who told you to do what you did? The red-faced man might ask, and Istvin would answer, they did. Who are they? The man would reposit. Sorry, that's not a word I know. Reposit. We'll say it. I'll say it like that for now. The ones who told me, Istvin answered, quite truthfully. It went on and on like that, sometimes very much like a merry-go-round, sometimes like other rides at the carnival. Rides Istvin had never ridden, but which he had seen vids of. He wished he could ride them. They might be fun. As long as he could think about carnival rides, it did not bother Istvin to have this conversation. But it seemed to bother the red-faced man, and he would get very angry and lean over the table and sometimes shout into Istvin's face. This shouting, too, he could think of as a carnival ride in a way, as long as he thought hard enough. After a while, the red-faced man got so irritated with him that he threw up his hands and left. Istvin was on his own, sitting in a chair, waiting. He did not mind being on his own, even preferred it in a way, so he just sat there. There was, somewhere deep in his head, a slow staticky sound that he could listen to, and so he listened to it, wondering if he would begin to hear the inside voices hiding in the static. That sometimes happened to him, but no, he did not hear voices, just the static. It was soothing, relaxing, and for a while he forgot where he was. When he remembered where he was again, the red faced man was back, shaking him this time, yelling again. Then he picked Isfin up by his shirt and lifted him off the chair and let him go so that he fell sprawling on the ground. Isfin lay there, confused, looking up at him, wondering why the man had done that to him when all he had been doing was just sitting, minding his own business. "Get up," the man said. "Why?" wondered Isfin. "I'm fine where I am." He lay there a while longer, just staring at the man. "Get up," the man repeated, and gave him a kick in the ribs. "This man is not your friend," a voice told him. It was an inside voice, he knew, because he could tell that the red-faced man did not hear it too. It was a voice just for him. Voices like that, voices just for him, made him feel special. "Not your friend," the voice repeated. "He's not?" he said. The man standing above him creased his brow in confusion. "No, he's not. In fact, he's your enemy. You need to get rid of him." "Rid of him how?" The red-faced man had taken a step back. "Who are you talking to?" "Start by getting up. Sit back in the chair. I'll tell you what to do." It was good to have a voice with him. It was good especially when the world around him was confusing and he didn't know what to do. The voices seemed to know more about the world than he did, even if sometimes they told him to do things that later he wasn't certain he should have done. But yes, he would listen to it. Slowly, he pulled himself around and stood up, then went to the chair. "There, that's better," said the red-faced man. "No," said the voice, "it isn't, but we will make it better." "Yes," said Istvan. He was talking to the voice, but the red-faced man thought he was talking to him, and so he nodded. "Good," the man said. "Now, are you ready to tell me what happened?" "Tell him yes," said the voice. And now the voice was no longer feeling like it was inside of him exactly. It was more than that somehow. He was beginning to see now a shadowy shape forming there right next to the red-faced man. Not a body exactly. It would never be a body. But he knew from past experience, eventually, it would be like a body. It was like his vision was slowly adjusting so that it could begin to see what was really there. He smiled. "Yes," he said. "Good," said the red-faced man. "Let's start at the beginning. Who were you working for?" The shadowy shape was now more or less human, though still a little blurred around the edges. He watched as the shadow man put its hands around the red-faced man's throat and pretend to choke him. The red-faced man didn't seem to notice. Then the shape turned to Istvin and nodded encouragingly. "Now you," it said. In an instant, he had sprung out of his chair and thrown himself across the table, knocking both the red-faced man and his chair backward. The man gave a startled cry, and then his head struck the cement floor, and his body was suddenly loose. Istvin clamped his fingers around the man's throat and squeezed. "Yes," said the shadow man, now kneeling beside him, an awful smile on its blurry lips. "Do it harder." And then the door burst open, and other hands were on him, tearing him off, dragging him away. "10. They bound his hands again, After a while, they brought him back into the interrogation room, unless it was a different room. Curious, he tried to look to see, but either this was a different room or they had cleaned up the blood. Or they had cleaned the blood up. Then more questions from several people this time, back and forth, none of them giving him a chance to do much. Where was the voice? Now that it had a shadow body, had it simply walked off? In any case, he couldn't hear it. He kept listening for it, but couldn't hear it. But it was so hard sometimes to hear the inside voices when there were so many outside voices talking. Whatever he was saying to answer the questions didn't seem to be satisfying them. They kept on asking him the same questions again and again, as if he had another answer to give them. So he stopped answering. This didn't seem to help any, though. They still kept on asking, and now they started acting like his body might have the answers as well. They kept yanking on his hair, or pushing his head down, or pushing his head up, or edging him out of the chair. When he hit the ground, he lay there, wondering if the inside voice would come back. But nothing happened. They were right there, all around them, but it felt to him like they were moving farther and farther away, like he was burrowing deeper and deeper into his own body, where they couldn't get at him. After a while, they took him away, down a hall and to a cell, and locked him in. Once he was alone, he felt himself slowly begin to fill up his body again, until the things around him felt like they were real and there again. His body, he realized, hurt a lot, ached all over. There were bruises on his arms and legs where they had hit him, and probably bruises on his face too, though there was no mirror or anything reflective he could use to examine it. There was the taste of blood in his mouth, and he seemed to be missing a tooth. He groaned a little, pulled himself onto the narrow cot, and lay there. How had this happened to him? Why were things always happening to him in ways that he had a hard time understanding? Was it the same thing for everybody or just for him? He thought back to Jency. Jency always seemed to understand the world around him more clearly. Why would that be the case? What's wrong with me? Wondered Istvan again. After a while, he fell asleep. He awoke to the sound of someone groaning. It took him a while to realize that it was him. His body hurt all over and was stiff now. He sat up slowly, holding his head. When he looked up, it was to see the gray man. You, said Istvan. Me, said the gray man. Are you real? Asked Istvan. A flicker of amusement passed over the man's face. We decided earlier I was, he said. Don't you remember? Istvan thought for a moment, then nodded. But maybe I was wrong, he said. Does it really matter if you were right or wrong? Asked the man. Who else is there to talk to? What do you want to talk about? Asked Istvan. You know what I want to talk about, said the gray man. Who told you to do what you did? Istvan just stared at him, then shook his head. I've tried to explain it, he said. I can't. You won't, you mean, said the man. No, said Istvan. Can't. I don't know why. The man stared at him thoughtfully. You really believe that, don't you? He said. Once Istvan nodded, he continued. I'm afraid it doesn't matter what you believe, he said patiently. The information is there. We're going to get to it, even if we have to break your skull open and filter it out bit by bit. And in the process, we'll make sure that you are never able to do anything like what you did again. He smiled. We have a reputation for being very thorough. It is not an undeserved reputation. Isvan had an impulse to stand up and fall on the gray man, but he suppressed it. He was afraid that the same thing would happen that happened before, that the gray man would fold up again into a gray box and then unfold into someone or something else. He did not want to see that happen again. So he stayed there, waiting. Part of him hoping the gray man would go away. Part of him hoping he would say something else that would help him to understand better the situation he was in. But when the gray man did not speak, Isvan finally cleared his throat. "What will happen to me next?" he asked. "Normally, you would go back into an interrogation room a few more times," said the gray man. "Maybe a dozen times, maybe 2. But what you did to my colleague has sped the process up a bit." "Your colleague?" "The man you strangled," he said. "Or rather, started to strangle and then cracked his skull." He shook his finger at Isfin. "That wasn't very nice of you." "But he told me to do it," said Isfin, and then noticed the gray man was staring at him with a delicately poised attention. "Who told you?" he asked. Isfin raised a hand and let it fall helplessly. Who had told him? At the time it seemed so clear, but now it seemed so confused. A man that was not a man, a figure made of smoke, a voice that perhaps was there, perhaps not. How was he to explain that, particularly to a man whose skin looked wrong? "I didn't mean to," he finally said. "You didn't answer my question," said the gray man. "I didn't?" The gray man smiled, shook his head. "No," he said, "you didn't." He sighed and rose from his chair, pushing up with his hands on his knees. "No matter," he said. "We'll have you for a long time. I don't need the answer today." The gray man started to move toward the door, then turned back. "You asked what would happen to you," he said. "Next step, since you sped things up by murdering a man who was just trying to do his to a secure location, a place not subject to the laws in place here. That'll make it easier to work on you." He smiled. "Work on you is obviously a euphemism," he said. "By the time we're done with you, I don't know how much of your mind will be left." He struck the door twice with the flat of his hand. "And again," he said. "It's an open question how much of your mind is there now." The door groaned and slid open. "Be seeing you," the gray man said, and slipped out. "11. But it was months, or what felt like months anyway, before he saw the gray man again. First, they left him alone in his cell for a while without food or water, and then, once he was very weak, finally gave him water. Then they beat the bottoms of his feet with a steel rod until he couldn't walk or even stand. They put a bag over his head and poured water over it so that it felt like he was drowning. They stripped him and left him shivering in a cold, bare room, and then yelled at him and insisted that he talk until he felt he had no choice but to retreat deeper and deeper into his body and watch it all from a distance. Most of it he watched with horror, but their growing frustration at being unable to crack him, he watched with a certain delight. How many days that went on, he couldn't say for certain. But then abruptly it came to an end. They again put a sack over his head and bound his hands and hustled him, careening down a corridor, laughing at him when he fell before yanking him back to his feet. Is it the same sack? He couldn't help wondering. But they put him in the vehicle again. But he didn't think it was the same vehicle they had put him in before. It felt different somehow. The tone of the space, even through the sack, was different. There was someone next to him holding him firmly by one arm, and someone on the other side of him holding him firmly by the other arm. They drove somewhere for a long time, maybe not all that long, suggested a voice somewhere inside of him, and when he heard it, he grunted with satisfaction into the hood. Welcome, voice, he thought. He felt one of the hands tighten on one of his arms, however, another place. At first, he thought he was going into a building, but when they finally had him inside and seated and had removed the sack from around his head, he saw that he wasn't in a building at all, but in some kind of aircraft. He was alone except for two guards. Where are we going? He asked. But the guards with him would not answer the question. They would not even look at him. There was a grating sound above them, and he saw light begin to flood in and realized they were in the spaceport. And then the ship's engines began to rise, and they were lifting straight up and into the air. That, of everything he had experienced so far, turned out to be the thing most akin to a carnival ride. He could feel his stomach pushing down, threatening to leave his body, and his whole body felt heavy, and he had a hard time breathing. And the voices in him drifted, tingling down from his head before getting tangled within his legs. And then they were through the upper lock of the dome, and the pressure began to diminish, to become less and less until it was almost non-existent. Soon they were circling a space station, synchronizing speed with it, and slowly coming closer until with a gentle thunk they had docked. Is this where we're going? Where we're going? He asked, but neither of the guards answered. It felt strange to be weightless, to feel like you hardly even had a body. It was like how sometimes the inside voices didn't have a body, he thought, and then thought, maybe I am becoming an inside voice. Maybe the inside voices weren't inside at all, he told himself, but in space, where they could exist without a body. He was webbed into his chair, but floating now, jostling gently back and forth against the webbing. But the two guards seemed to be sticking to the floor. Something about their boots holding them in place. He didn't have boots. Why not? They unwebbed him and, grabbing him by his elbows, propelled him gently through the air. But as they got closer to the hatch, he started to feel his body come back to him, and by the time they had gone through and into the station, he weighed nearly as much as he always had. Having a body again was something of a disappointment. They dragged him down around the wheel of the space station into a bigger bay where a larger ship was waiting. Not a gray plant hopper, but an interstellar vessel. Near it was the gray man, holding a rubberized sack. Ah, yes, Sven, he said. I've been waiting for you. Why? Asked Isven. Now that these fine gentlemen have tried their best, he said, gesturing to the two guards. It's my turn. He gestured to the guard. Take him in. Into the ship. They passed a series of crew members, many of whom regarded him nervously. No need to be alarmed, said the gray man to one of them. You never saw this. The gray man directed them down a flight of stairs and through a thick metal door marked restricted area on the outside. Inside was a chamber lined with metal cabinets, a grate cut into the floor. The room was freshly washed, water still puddled on the floor, but there was nevertheless an odd smell to it, something that Isvin couldn't quite place. In the room's center were 3 reclining rubber and metal chairs, all of them bolted securely to the floor, each equipped with a series of restraints. Strap him in, boys, said the gray man. Eventually, they did. First, though, they removed his restraints and then removed his clothing, making a neat pile of it to one side. For a moment, Isfin thought of trying to break free, but he was too weak to do much of anything. They led him to the chair and strapped down his arms and his legs, and then fixed a head strap as well, something to keep him from turning either left or right. Then they saluted the small gray man and left the room. They can see you. You're real, said Isfin. I thought we already agreed that I was real, said the gray man. Can't you accept anything as meaning something once and for all? No, thought Isfin. No, I can't. He had been hurt too many times, burnt too often by a world that seemed to be constantly changing, constantly shifting out of his grasp. The small gray man came forward and stroked Istvin's hair. Now we're alone, he said, and then he reached into a sack. And took out a razor and began to shave the hair roughly away, sometimes nicking and gouging Istvin's scalp. We have lots of things to play with, said the man, gesturing to the cabinets. We've got a lot of time before we arrive where we're going, and where the fun will really start. He reached into the rubberized sack, bringing out a hypodermic and a needle in a plastic casing. He affixed the second to the first and broke the casing away. No reason we should wait until we arrive to get things started, he said, and smiled. He primed the needle and then brought it slowly down until it was no longer within Istvin's field of vision. Istvin felt a sharp prick in his arm, followed by a burning sensation, and he winced. The burning pushed its way down toward his fingertips and began to climb up his arm. How does that feel? Asked the small gray man, almost in a whisper. He was holding the hypodermic up again, and Istvin could see that it was empty, the needle slick with blood. Istvin felt the burning push its way past his shoulder, and then insinuate itself into his chest and neck. And then suddenly, it felt like the top of his skull had been torn off, and the skull filled with liquid fire. He gasped, could see in his wavering vision the smiling face of the gray man. And the worst part was that even as he struggled to catch his breath, even as he tried and failed to stay focused and keep a grip on his mind, even as pain rapidly transformed into the worst thing he had ever felt, he experienced a brief moment of lucidity. He couldn't help but realize that this was only the beginning, and that before it was over, it was sure to get much, much worse. Okay, and so as I said, part 2 is supremely short. So next up will be part 3, chapters, if I look this up, 12 to 21. So I say the next part, I don't know, if it is longer, I might leave it off then to Sunday, because that way I'm guaranteed the more time to read it. Also, I'm not tired after work. Considering what happened in the second part of part 1 that I read last Sunday. But either way, that is it for today. So thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video and listening to me read. Until next time, guys. See ya. End stream.